We now come to section 3. Here we will talk about different kinds of restrictions and agreements. Let's start with tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods collected by the government. The idea is straightforward. Here is a particular country. It imports goods from abroad, and for all the goods that are imported, there is a certain amount of tax collected by the government. Tariffs are generally popular in countries where the government finds it difficult to collect taxes from its own people. The justification for tariffs are generally shown right here. The justification for tariffs are shown here. One is to protect a domestic industry. A country might say that we want to develop the auto industry in our country, and to do so we will import high tariffs on cars that are imported. The objective might also be to reduce the trade deficit. If a given country has low exports and high imports, it will run a large trade deficit, and the government might say that we want to discourage imports by increasing the tariffs. In almost all cases, there is a loss in overall welfare when a government imposes tariffs. And we will understand that by looking at a picture over here in the context of what is called a small country. In this discussion, a small country means that a country is small, or the demand for a particular good is small relative to the global demand. Such a country will be a price taker. And to understand this, think about a relatively small country like Portugal. Portugal imports cars from the rest of the world, say from Japan, Germany, etc. But Portugal's imports have no impact on the global price of cars. So we can say that Portugal is a small country. We can also take a country like Brazil, which is physically big, but Brazil's import of cars probably has no impact on the price of cars in the global market. So in the context of the global auto industry, both Brazil and Portugal are small countries. A large country is one where the imports or the behavior of that particular country has a substantial impact on the price of the good that we are talking about. The United States, for example, will have a substantial impact on the prices of cars in the global market. If the United States were to import tariffs on car imports, then that would impact the global auto industry. So we can say that the United States is not a price taker in this context. Most countries tend to be small, and that is the scenario that we will first talk about. What we are looking at here is the domestic demand of a small country, let's say for cars, and this is the domestic supply again of cars. If we do not have any trade, then this would be the autarkic price, and this would be the autarkic quantity based on the intersection of supply and demand. But let's say that we do have free trade, and say that the price of cars in the global market is 100. If there is free trade, then the country that we are talking about here, let's say Portugal, can import cars at this price, which is the global price. At this particular price, the demand for cars will be over here, and let's say that this number is 50,000. The supply of cars might be 10,000, which means that the import then would be the difference between these two numbers, 50 and 40, which is 40,000. The government sees these imports and decides to impose a 50% tariff. If that happens, then the price of cars in Portugal becomes 150, because for the consumer, he is paying 100 plus effectively the 50 tariff. So his price is 150. At 150, the domestic production will go up because now the price in the market is 150. So the domestic supply or production goes up to 20. What about the demand? The demand will come down. Say the demand comes down to 40. Now the amount imported is this distance over here, which is 20. So notice that imports go down. But what else is going on over here? Is there any impact to the consumer surplus? When we had free trade and no tariffs, then the consumer surplus was this entire area over here. In fact, this whole triangle. And this connects back with what you saw earlier in economics. In fact, in the first couple of readings where we talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus, consumer surplus means that a consumer is willing to pay this amount indicated by the demand curve, which is also the marginal benefit curve. The consumer is only paying 100. So this entire area then represents consumer surplus. When the tariff is imposed, then the price comes up to 150. So this area over here is consumer surplus that has been lost. So there is a substantial reduction in consumer surplus. On the next slide, we'll go over an example where you need to calculate the loss in consumer surplus. Where does this consumer surplus go? Some of it goes to producers. Remember, initially our producer surplus was the area below 100 and above this supply curve. So initially this was the producer surplus. Now the price has gone up to 150. So this area over here is an increase in the producer surplus. What about the government revenue? The reason for importing tariffs was so that the government can get some revenue, and possibly these other reasons also existed, but mostly the biggest reason is for the government to get revenue. How much is that revenue? The revenue is equal to the number of cars imported multiplied by the tariff per car. The tariff per car is 50. The number of cars imported is 20,000. So this rectangle over here represents the revenue for the government. These two triangles over here and over here represent the loss in welfare to the country. Why? Because this particular area is lost and it's not going to anyone. If we connect this with material that we saw earlier in economics, this was called the dead weight loss, and in this particular reading we are calling it the loss in national welfare. And that's what we mean by this statement over here, that tariffs generally result in a loss in welfare. Let us now come to the large country situation, and remember, a large country is one which is a substantial importer. It is conceivable that when a large country imposes a tariff, then the terms of trade change. For example, the exporter might then reduce prices recognizing that there is a tariff. How will this impact the terms of trade? If you think about the large country as being the United States and the exporter, let's say, is Japan, if the United States imposes a tariff, it is conceivable that Japan reduces the price of cars. So the terms of trade, price of exports over price of imports, will go up, because if Japan reduces the price of imports, then the terms of trade will improve. And it is conceivable that the improvement in the terms of trade offset the loss in national welfare. This will not necessarily happen, but it can happen. So recognize that fact. But overall, if we combine the impact of Japan and the United States, the net effect considering both countries will be a decrease or loss in welfare. Now let's work through this particular example, and this is example 5 from the curriculum. I think this material is very testable because effectively what is happening here is that we are testing material from this reading as well as from earlier readings. And if you think about it, on your exam, there are only 24 questions from economics. Economics is 10%, so 10% of 240 is 24. If I were making your exam, then I would look for questions where I can cover multiple readings in one question, and this is one possible area where that can be done. Before you look at the solution, I want you to try and solve this problem. The first thing that you should do here is create this picture. This is the domestic demand, domestic supply, price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We are told that assuming there is free trade, then the global price is 5. That's this line over here. The domestic demand is 200. The quantity supplied is 110,000. So those are the 2 points. When there is a tariff of 20%, the price goes up to 6. The amount produced and supplied internally goes up to 130. The demand comes down from 200 to 170. Effectively, this question gives you all the data that you need. Then, what is the loss in consumer surplus? We did this on the previous slide. The loss in consumer surplus is given by this particular area, which is a rectangle plus a triangle. The area of the rectangle is 170 times 1 plus this particular triangle, half base into height. Base is 30 into 1 into half, which is 15. We have 170 plus 15, which is 185,000. Calculate the gain in producer surplus. The gain in producer surplus is this particular area. Again, you have a rectangle and a triangle. You can come up with that area, which is 120,000. Calculate the gain in government revenue arising from the imposition of the tariff. The government revenue is given by this particular rectangle, which would be 40 multiplied by 1. So this is 40,000. And the deadweight loss or loss in welfare, that is the sum of these two triangles. The answer here is 25,000. And again, I'll emphasize that I think this is an important testable question. Next we come to quotas. Quotas are limits on the absolute amount of imports allowed over some period, and typically that period is a year. From a testability perspective, it is important to understand the difference between tariffs and quotas. And notice that I have reproduced the same picture that we had on the previous slides related to tariffs. Let's say that the government imposes a quota equal to this amount. Then effectively what will happen is domestic producers will produce this much. The quota amount for imports is this amount. So the society or the consumers will get this quantity. The price which originally was over here, this is the price assuming free trade, would go up to the same price that we had with a tariff. On the surface, it seems like quotas and tariffs are having the same impact, but there is a subtle difference. With a tariff, this amount was clearly tariff revenue that was going to the government. With a quota, that is not as obvious, because potentially what can happen is the exporter can now charge a higher amount and earn this extra profit. That extra profit is called a quota rent. If this does indeed happen, then the loss in national welfare would be this triangle plus the rectangle in the middle plus this triangle over here. With a tariff, the loss in national welfare was only the sum of the two triangles. Having said that, if the government can somehow impose a license fee or create what is called import licenses or sell import licenses and capture this amount, then the revenue for the government will be the same as the revenue in a tariff situation. With a voluntary export restraint, we have the exporting country which agrees to limit the exports of a particular good. Just to make sure you understand the distinction between voluntary export restraints and quotas, let's go back to the example of the United States and Japan. Let's say that Japan exports cars to the United States. An import quota will be one where the United States imposes quotas on how many cars can come in from Japan. A voluntary export restraint would be where the Japanese government imposes a quota, or the Japanese automakers collectively agree on how many cars they will export to the United States. In many ways, the effect will be similar, but there is one important distinction. When there is a voluntary export restraint, then this particular economic rent is going to be captured by Japan, because in this scenario, the United States cannot sell import licenses. The restriction is coming from the Japanese end. And this was in fact done by Japan in 1981. Export subsidies. Export subsidies are payments by the government for each unit exported. Generally, the objective is to stimulate exports. When there are export subsidies, then the exporter has an incentive to focus on the export market. But the issue here is that you have an exporter exporting to other countries, let's say the importer. If there are subsidies in this country and products are being sold at a relatively low price, then what the importing country can do is impose tariffs or what are called countervailing duties. So effectively the price will go up over here in the importing country. If a small country imposes export subsidies, then domestic prices will rise. This is because domestic producers will focus more on the export market. The amount produced for the local market will go down and hence prices will go up. If a large country imposes export subsidies, then by definition world prices decline as quantity increases. When this happens, the benefit of the subsidy is actually being partially transferred to the importing country. The net welfare is down both in the cases of a large country as well as a small country. The net welfare decreases further, or decreases actually more, in the case of a large country, because some of the benefit is being transferred to the trading partner or the importing country. Over here I have reproduced an exhibit from the curriculum, panel A and panel B. These panels summarize what we have talked about, and I think you should go over this material because you are likely, or because this material is quite testable. I'll just help you read this. We are given the different sorts of restrictions. Let's look at the first one, a tariff. What is the impact on the importing country? And note that with the tariff, we talked about the impact on the importing country. We talked about the fact that the producer surplus increases, consumer surplus goes down, government revenue increases by the amount of the tariff multiplied by the quantity that is imported. There is a decrease in national welfare for a small country. With a large country, there is a possible increase in the welfare. Now again, note, this is not always the case. This might happen. With an import quota, again, the impact is on the importing country. The content here is essentially similar to what we see with the tariff. The difference is related to the government revenue. The impact on government revenue is mixed. It depends on whether the quota rents are captured by the importing country through sale of licenses or by the exports. And again, with national welfare, there is a decrease in small country welfare. With a large country, there could be an increase. Export subsidy impacts the exporting country. The producer surplus increases, consumer surplus decreases, government revenue falls because a subsidy by definition is a negative tax. So the government spending rises and national welfare decreases. With a voluntary export restraint, the impact is on the importing country. The producer surplus increases, consumer surplus decreases. There is no impact on government revenue. Remember, the benefit is being captured by the exporter and the national welfare goes down. This slide shows the impact on price, domestic consumption, domestic production and trade. Again, we have gone through all this material. Make sure you can remember this content. Now let's do a small example, and again I think this is quite testable. Thailand, a small country, has to decide whether to impose a tariff or a quota on the import of computers. You are considering investing in a local firm that is a major importer of computers. The good thing about this example is that it connects what you are learning in economics with your role as a financial analyst or your role as an investor. I want you to answer these questions before you look at the solution. If you've understood what we've talked about so far, this will be very straightforward. What is the impact on prices in Thailand? When there is a tariff, obviously prices will go up. Quantity produced will go up because now the domestic price is higher, so domestic producers will produce more. Quantity imported in Thailand is going to come down. If Thailand imposes a tariff, what will the impact be on prices in the exporting country? Remember, Thailand is a small country that has been specified here, which means that it is a price taker. Thailand's actions do not impact the price of computers outside Thailand, especially in the exporting country here. So there is no impact. How would a tariff affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue? The consumer surplus comes down, the producer surplus goes up, and the government revenue goes up. There are three more questions. Explain whether the net effect of a tariff is the same as that of a quota. And we've been through this. With a tariff, clearly the revenue goes to the government. With a quota, the effect is mixed. There is this quota rent, which could be captured by the exporter or it could be captured by the government depending on the government's actions. Which policy, a tariff or a quota, would be most beneficial to the local importer in which you may invest and why? This is a good question. If you think of a local importer and a tariff, the tariff is not good for the importer because that extra tariff is simply going to the government, and with the tariff the quantity comes down. So overall this will hurt the local importer. On the other hand, if there is a quota, then whether or not the importer benefits depends on whether the importer can capture any of that quota rent. If the importer can capture some of this quota rent, then the importer will be better off with a quota. If Thailand were to negotiate a voluntary export restraint with the countries from which it imports computers, would this be better or worse than an import quota for the local importing firm in which you may invest? The answer here is that the local firm will not benefit. All the benefit goes to the exporting firm. So generally, this is not a smart thing to do for the importing country. Trading blocks, common markets, and economic unions. Trading blocks are also called regional trading agreements or RTAs. And let's look at the different kinds of agreements. The most basic is called a free trade area or a free trade agreement. What happens here is that there are no trade restrictions between members, but each member or each country will have its own policy with non-members. A classic example of a free trade agreement is NAFTA, which is the agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Goods and services can flow between these countries, but each country has its own policies with other countries. As an example, the United States will have its own policy with China, Mexico will have its own policy with China, and so on. The next level of integration is a customs union. In addition to this, all member countries adopt a common set of trade restrictions with non-members. So if Canada, US, and Mexico were to say that they have one customs zone and they have the same agreements with other countries, then we would have a customs union. The next level of integration is a common market. Here, in addition to what we talked about with the customs union, all barriers to the movement of labor and capital goods among member countries are removed. In other words, labor and capital now can move freely between all the members of a common market. An economic union is the next level of integration. Here, member countries establish common institutions and economic policy. And the final level of integration is a monetary union where all countries adopt a single currency. And the classic example would be the Eurozone. This might sound simple, but on an exam it might be hard to recall the exact definition of each of these. So I'm just going to make a suggestion for how to remember this. If you can think of a better way, then you can let me know, or you can post your method on our discussion group. Hopefully it is easy to remember the extremes. The first and most basic form of agreement is to have a free trade area or a free trade agreement, and the classic example there being NAFTA. At the other end, we have a monetary union, and the classic example there is the Eurozone. So those are easy to remember. Then you just have three other sorts of agreements to remember. Customs union simply means that these three countries now have a common set of rules. A customs union simply means that we are removing this constraint. In other words, there is one customs policy, so we say we have a customs union. The next level, and I know this might sound a little silly, but think of this as CM, come on Mexico. What this is saying is all people from Mexico are free to come and work in the United States. Now, I know that that is not likely to happen anytime soon, but just to help you remember, the next level after a customs union, let's say NAFTA is going deeper and deeper towards a union, then the next level would be where people from Mexico are allowed to come work in the United States. So CM, come on Mexico, you can think of it that way. Again, not likely to happen anytime in the near future. And then the next level is where the three countries of North America, they come up with a common set of institutions that make economic policy. So from CM, we go on to economic union, and finally we have a monetary union. Not sure if that helps or not, but make sure you remember what each of these means. Examples 7 and 8. Example 7 is MCQ based, so it is indicative of what you might get. Example 8 is not MCQ based, but it is a small question, so make sure you do it. The final point on this slide is that RTAs, or regional trade agreements, generally tend to be more popular than large multilateral trading agreements. And the reason is that it is easier for countries that are near each other to trade and interact with each other. The final part of section 3 has to do with capital restrictions. Some governments restrict the inward and or outward flow of capital, and that is what we mean when we say capital restrictions. Restrictions on inflows might be due to strategic or defense related reasons. So a given country might say that they do not want foreigners investing in a particular industry that is either strategic or defense related. Another reason given for capital restrictions is that at times it might cause volatility in the financial markets of a country. And the rationale is as follows. If foreigners invest in the financial markets of a given country and there is an economic crisis in the region or in the country, then foreigners are likely to quickly pull out their money. And the argument goes that if this country easily allows foreigners to put in money and pull out money, then the capital markets in the country will tend to go up and down very easily. The volatility will be high, which will be detrimental to this particular economy. Now, this is the reason given. Economists might not agree with this. In fact, there are some studies that suggest that when economies open up and allow capital to flow in and out very easily, then in the long run, the impact on volatility is not that much. In fact, some studies indicate that the riskiness of markets actually goes down. But nevertheless, recognize the fact that there are some instances of this happening, so it is presented as a reason. Why do countries not like money leaving their country? This happens with countries like Pakistan, for example, with scarce foreign exchange, and countries will then like to restrict any outflows. If a country already has limited foreign exchange, then it would not make sense for residents of the country to be allowed to take money out of the country. And related to that is the fact that small countries with limited amounts of foreign exchange would like the people of their country to invest in the country so as to boost local industry. As I alluded to earlier, overall, in the long term, capital restrictions tend to reduce welfare. I don't think we need to get too detailed into this area, but as long as you recognize these main points, you are in good shape. If you do want some more detail, I would suggest you read example 9 in the curriculum.